The wind swept across the dry Arizona plains, dragging trails of dust along the cracked earth as the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged cliffs. The air was still heavy with the scent of sagebrush and the faint smoke of an abandoned campfire. In the distance, a lonely coyote's cry echoed, breaking the silence that had hung over the desert since dawn. A single wagon stood tilted on a broken wheel, its canvas torn, its shadow stretching long against the golden light. Near the wagon lay a woman, her dress smeared with dust and blood, her hands trembling as she clutched her swollen belly. Her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. She was young, but the desert had aged her in a single day. The harsh sun had burnt her skin, and her lips were cracked and dry. Her hair, once neat and tied beneath a bonnet, now clung to her damp forehead. Her eyes darted toward the fading trail, the one that had carried her husband away only hours before. "Please, don't leave me here," she whispered, her voice breaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. But he was already gone. The man she had trusted to protect her had taken the horse and fled when he saw the riders approaching from the ridge. Apache. That was all he'd managed to say before vanishing into the distance, leaving her with an empty water canteen and a heart full of terror. The stories she had heard about the Apache came flooding back. Tales told by campfire, always whispered, never spoken loud. To settlers, the name meant danger. They were said to be ruthless warriors who struck without warning, who vanished into the rocks as if the land itself obeyed them. Mothers would hush their children at night with warnings of the Apache. But as the woman lay there, she felt less afraid of death than of the lonely silence stretching out before her. Hours passed. The light dimmed, and the world turned copper and red. Her strength waned with every breath, and her mind drifted between memory and the present. She remembered the soft hum of her husband's voice as he promised her a better life in the West. He'd said there would be land rich and green, where their child could grow free. Now, all she could see was endless dust, and the mocking shimmer of heat on the horizon. Then she heard it, the soft rhythm of hooves against the sand. She froze. The sound grew louder, echoing off the rocks like a drumbeat of fate. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to crawl beneath the wagon, but her body refused to move. Her hands shook as she gripped the dry earth, praying for it to swallow her whole from behind the ridge. A group of riders appeared, their horses moving like shadows against the dying light. There were 5 of them, all in buckskin and beads, their long hair tied with strips of leather. Spears and rifles rested across their saddles, and the desert wind lifted their feathers, making them seem almost unreal, like spirits born from the land itself. The woman shut her eyes tight, tears spilling down her cheeks. She whispered a prayer, half to God, half to anyone who might hear. Her heart hammered in her chest as she heard the riders dismount, their boots crunching softly in the sand. A voice spoke in a low, unfamiliar tone. She couldn't understand the words, but there was no anger in them, only curiosity. When she dared to open her eyes, one of them stood over her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with sun and hardship. His eyes were dark, steady, watching her not with cruelty, but with something else, something unreadable. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. As though not to startle a wild creature, she tried to speak, but her throat burned. "Please," she whispered, barely a sound. "Please don't leave me here." The Apache looked down at her, saying nothing. He touched the edge of her torn dress, the dirt on her hands, the swelling of her stomach. He turned his head and said something to the others. They exchanged quiet words she couldn't understand. Then, to her surprise, he reached into a small pouch hanging from his belt and pulled out a skin of water. He held it to her lips. The woman hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. But thirst won over fear. The water was warm and bitter, yet it felt like life itself. Tears of relief stung her eyes as she drank. When she tried to speak again, her voice broke. "Thank you," she whispered. The Apache didn't reply. His expression was distant, unreadable. He looked toward the horizon, the direction her husband had gone. For a long moment he stared into that fading line of dust, as if deciding something. Then he looked back at her, his jaw tightening. He spoke again, low and firm, to the others. One of them protested, shaking his head sharply, but the leader cut him off. The others mounted their horses again, their faces set with disapproval. But the tall man stayed. The woman's heart pounded. She couldn't understand what was happening. Why hadn't he left her? What did he want? Fear began to creep back in as he stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. He lifted her gently, placing her across his horse as if she weighed nothing. She tried to resist, weakly pushing against him, but her body betrayed her. The world spun in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Why? Why are you doing this? She murmured, her words trembling. The Apache didn't answer. He adjusted the reins, his face calm but his eyes distant, as though carrying a burden she couldn't see. He mounted the horse behind her, steadying her with one arm as the animal began to move. As they rode through the dimming desert, she could hear the soft thud of hooves, the rustle of wind through dry grass, the cry of a hawk above. Night was falling fast. The cold crept in, and she shivered. Pressing closer against the warmth of the man who had once been her greatest fear, the stars began to appear, scattered across the sky like broken glass. She looked up at them, her thoughts fading in and out. Was he taking her to his people? To be a prisoner? Or was he simply saving her from the desert's cruel silence? After a long while, the Apache spoke, his voice low and careful, as though unused to the English tongue. "Your man left you," he said. His accent was heavy, but his words were clear. She nodded faintly, a tear sliding down her cheek. He was quiet for a moment, then said something she did not expect. "My people. They would have left you too." She looked up, startled, but he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. There was something in his tone, sorrow, perhaps, or regret. Whatever it was, it didn't fit the stories she had heard. They rode on through the night until the moon rose high, casting silver light across the desert floor. The woman's strength gave out again, and she drifted into uneasy sleep, her head resting against his chest. The Apache watched the road ahead, his expression unreadable. Each mile carried him further from his own people's laws, deeper into a choice he could never undo. He knew what they would say if they found out. He knew what the cost would be. But still, he rode on. By the time dawn began to break, the world was silent again, save for the whisper of the wind through the canyons and the faint cry of a newborn life stirring within the woman he carried. Somewhere in the distance, smoke rose, thin, curling, signaling the camp of his tribe. He hesitated, pulling the reins tight. For a moment, he just stared at the smoke, torn between duty and something he couldn't yet name. The woman stirred, opening her eyes weakly. Where are you taking me?" He didn't answer. His jaw clenched as he looked from her to the horizon, where the first light of morning painted the world in gold. Then, slowly, he turned his horse, not toward his people, but away from them, and in that silent moment, beneath the vast old American sky, the unimaginable had already begun. The morning light spread slowly across the desert, painting the land in shades of gold and rust. The air was cool now, the kind of calm that only comes before the heat of the day settles in. The Apache rode in silence, guiding the horse carefully along a narrow trail between two ridges. The woman sat weakly in front of him, wrapped in a blanket he had pulled from his saddle. Her eyes were half open, watching the endless stretch of red rock and dry sagebrush ahead. Every breath felt heavy, every sound too sharp. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The woman's thoughts drifted between fear and confusion. She didn't know where he was taking her, or why he had turned away from the smoke she'd seen earlier. She had thought that was his village, and part of her had expected to be handed over as a captive. But instead, he had chosen the opposite direction, as if escaping from his own people. Her mind kept returning to her husband. She wanted to hate him for leaving her, but part of her still hoped he'd come back. Maybe he'd gone to find help, she told herself. Maybe he would return with soldiers or settlers. But deep inside, she knew better. She had seen the fear in his eyes when he'd fled, the kind of fear that turns men into strangers. The Apache finally stopped near a small canyon, hidden from view by tall rocks. He dismounted and helped her down, his hands firm but careful. She could barely stand, so he steadied her until she sat against a rock. He took a small pouch from his horse and pulled out some dried meat and a strip of bread. When he offered it to her, she hesitated. He noticed his expression unreadable and tore off a piece himself before handing it back. "It's safe," he said simply. His voice was low, the English words rough but clear. She accepted it, nibbling slowly, her eyes still fixed on him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You could have left me there." He didn't answer right away. He crouched near the fire pit he was building, arranging stones and small pieces of wood. "Because no one should die like that," he finally said. His tone was quiet, matter of fact. She looked down at her hands. "Your people, they would not agree with you?" He paused, glancing at her. "No," he said after a long silence. "They would not." The fire crackled to life, and for the first time she could see him clearly in the light. His face was lined but not old, his eyes dark and steady. Scars marked his arms, old ones, faint but deep. Around his neck hung a small leather cord with a carved stone, worn smooth from years of touch. He didn't look like a savage, as the story said. He looked like a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. "What is your name?" she asked softly. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a small bowl from his saddlebag, filled it with water from a canteen, and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. She took it, sipping slowly. The water eased her throat, and she looked up again, waiting. Finally he said, "My name is Kosa." She repeated it quietly, as if testing the sound. "Kosa." He nodded once. "And you?" "My name is Clara," she whispered. Kosa gave no sign of emotion, but his gaze softened for a brief second before turning back to the fire. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind sweeping through the canyon. As the day grew warmer, Clara tried to rest, though sleep came in uneasy fits. She dreamt of home, of the small house near the river, of laughter that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. When she woke, Kosa was gone, and for a moment, panic gripped her. She tried to rise, but her body was too weak. Then she heard the sound of footsteps, and Kosa appeared. Carrying a bundle of dried grass and a rabbit he had caught, he cleaned and cooked it without a word, his movements smooth and practiced. Clara watched him quietly, unsure what to say. When he handed her a piece, she took it gratefully. Hunger had stripped away hesitation. After a while, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You said your people would not help me. Why?" Kosa stared into the fire. "They have seen what happens when they help white people," he said slowly. "Promises are made, then broken. Our land grows smaller. Our families are taken. Every kindness becomes a weapon used against us." Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest that had nothing to do with her body. "I'm not like them," she said softly. He turned to her, his eyes steady. "Maybe not. But they would not care. They see your face, your skin, and they remember what has been done."
I argue with that.
She'd heard men in her wagon train speak of the Apache as if they were beasts, not people. They had carried rifles and hatred in equal measure, calling it justice. And yet here she was, alive only because one of those so-called savages had chosen to save her. As the sun began to set again, Kosa gathered his things. "We move before night," he said. "It is not safe to stay here." "Are we being followed?" Clara asked nervously. "Maybe," he replied. "Your husband's trail was easy to see. If others come looking, they will find where we were." She looked toward the open desert, her heart sinking. "He's not coming back, is he?" Kosa didn't answer. Instead, he lifted her gently onto the horse again, tying a strip of cloth across the saddle to keep her steady. The horse began to move, its slow rhythm blending with the fading hum of the desert. The night grew colder. Stars shone brighter than she had ever seen before, stretching endlessly across the sky. For a moment, Clara forgot her fear. The desert seemed almost peaceful, vast, and ancient, like it belonged to another world. Kosa rode with quiet patience, scanning the horizon for danger. Clara could sense his caution, the way his body tensed whenever a sound broke the silence. She realized then that he was risking more than she had understood. When dawn came, they reached a valley where a small stream wound its way between cottonwood trees. The air was cooler here, and birds sang softly in the distance. Kosa helped her down and began to build another small camp. Clara watched him, her curiosity growing stronger than her fear. "Do you have a family?" she asked. Kosa didn't look up. "Not anymore," he said quietly. She wanted to ask more, but the sadness in his voice stopped her. Instead, she turned her gaze to the stream, watching the sunlight shimmer across the water. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded slightly, but said nothing more. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like two people learning how to exist near each other without understanding why. As the hours passed, Clara began to notice things she hadn't before. The way Kosa always rode slightly to the side, keeping himself between her and the open trail. The way his eyes never rested for long, always watching the land. The way he spoke to his horse in quiet tones, as though it understood every word. When she asked him where they were going, he hesitated before answering. "There is a trading post 2 days from here. I will take you there. You can find your people. And what about you?" she asked. He looked away. "I cannot go there," Clara frowned. "They would hurt you." Kosa nodded once. "They see me as enemy. It does not matter what I have done." For a long moment, she didn't speak. The thought of being left alone again filled her with dread, yet she knew he was right. If anyone saw them together, he would be blamed. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that his path was more dangerous than hers. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, Clara asked quietly, "Why did you turn away from your people's camp yesterday?" Kosa's eyes reflected the flames as he stared into them. "Because they would not have let you live," he said simply. Her breath caught. "You risked everything. For me." He looked at her then, his face calm, but his eyes filled with something deeper. "A life is still a life," he said, "even if it does not belong to my people." The fire crackled softly between them. The desert stretched out around them, silent and endless. Clara felt the weight of his words settle in her heart. She didn't know what waited ahead, safety or another kind of danger, but she knew one thing for certain. The man beside her had already defied every rule he'd ever known. As the wind shifted and the embers glowed low, Kosa looked toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Somewhere out there, in the vast silence, a faint drumbeat echoed, distant, slow, but unmistakable. He rose to his feet, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. Clara followed his gaze, fear returning to her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. Kosa's voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp with alertness. "Someone is coming," he said. The night around them held its breath, and in that still moment, the line between protector and hunted began to blur. The night was thick with silence, the kind that made even the smallest sound feel loud and dangerous. The fire had burned down 2 glowing embers, and the shadows around the canyon grew darker by the minute. Kosa stood still, every muscle tense, listening to the faint beat that drifted on the wind. It wasn't the steady rhythm of a rider or the shuffle of hooves. It was slower, deliberate, a signal. Somewhere in the distance, others were out there, and they knew how to move unseen. Clara felt her heart pounding as she watched him. "Is it your people?" she whispered. Kosa didn't answer right away. His eyes searched the horizon, scanning the darkness. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but heavy with concern. "No, different drums. Not Apache." Her throat tightened. "Then who?" He didn't reply. Instead, he stepped to his horse and began tightening the saddle straps. His movements were fast but calm, each one practiced from years of knowing danger before it arrived. Clara pushed herself up, struggling to stand. "Tell me what's happening," she said, her voice shaking. Kosa glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Bandits," he said finally. "They follow trails. Sometimes they come for trade wagons. Sometimes for blood." Clara's breath caught. She thought of her husband again, of the wagon that now lay abandoned somewhere behind them. Maybe those same men had been watching all along. Maybe they were the reason he'd run. Kosa threw sand over the fire, smothering the light. "We go now," he said. She didn't argue. He lifted her carefully onto the horse, his arms steady at her back. The moonlight cast long silver streaks across the rocks as they moved, the sound of hooves muffled by sand and brush. Clara tried not to look behind, but curiosity kept tugging at her. In the distance, she could still hear the faint echo of drums, not steady anymore, but scattered. Like someone sending a message that only a few would understand. They rode for what felt like hours, till the moon dipped behind a line of cliffs. The cold air bit at their faces. Kosa slowed the horse near a grove of mesquite trees and stopped. "We rest here," he said. Clara's body ached, but she said nothing. Kosa dismounted first, then helped her down. His eyes were always moving, scanning the shadows, the ridges, even the sky. She realized he was listening not just for what was near, but for what WASN single quotes. She sat on a rock, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You knew this land," she said softly. "Every sound, every trail?" Kosa nodded. "This land remembers everything," he replied. "The ground keeps the stories of the people who walked it. You only have to know how to listen." Ashi. His words lingered with her. The desert had always seemed empty to her before. But now, she could feel the life pulsing quietly beneath its surface, the rustle of night creatures, the sigh of wind against stone, the heartbeat of the land itself. After a while, Kosa crouched near her, his voice low. "We must move by dawn. If those men are near, they will follow our tracks when the light returns." Clara nodded weakly. Her strength was fading, but fear kept her awake. She looked up at him, studying his face in the dim light. "Why do they hunt us?" she asked. "We have nothing," Kosa hesitated. "To them, a woman alone in the desert is something," he said. "And an Apache man traveling with her, that is reason enough for hate." The truth hit her like a cold wind. She had been so focused on her own fear that she hadn't seen his. He was risking more than she had imagined. Not only was he hunted by his own people for saving her, but now the white men who roamed these lands would see him as an enemy. Too, when the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they moved again. The world around them glowed pale gold, the air dry and sharp. Clara's body ached from the long ride, but she didn't complain. The silence between them had become something unspoken, a fragile understanding born of survival. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide plain. In the distance, Clara could see faint lines of smoke rising, a settlement, maybe a day's ride away. "Is that the trading post?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Kosa studied it for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "But it is not safe yet." "Why not?" He pointed to the valley below. Tracks, hoof prints, deep and recent. Whoever had made them had passed not long before. "They are near," he said. They turned toward a narrow ravine, a place where rocks jutted like teeth from the earth. It was there that Kosa decided to stop. "We wait here," he said, "until night." The hours passed slowly. Clara's thoughts wandered to the people she'd once known, neighbors, family, faces blurred by distance and time. She wondered if they'd believe her story if she lived to tell it. A white woman saved by an Apache. It would sound like madness. As the sun began to dip again, Kosa suddenly tensed. He lifted his hand for silence. Voices drifted faintly on the wind, rough, careless laughter. Clara's stomach twisted as she recognized the sound of English words, slurred and sharp. Kosa moved quickly, leading the horse into the shadow of a rock outcrop. "Stay low," he whispered. They crouched together as two riders appeared on the ridge above them. The men wore tattered coats and wide-brimmed hats, their rifles resting easy in their hands. They stopped, scanning the valley. "You see that trail?" One of them called out, "Looks fresh." The other spat into the dust. "Could be them settlers from the broken wagon. I told you they wouldn't get far." Clara's heart hammered. She pressed closer against the rocks, trying not to breathe. Kosa's hand rested lightly on his knife, but he didn't move. After a tense minute, the riders turned their horses and rode off toward the west. The sound of their laughter, faded with the wind. Clara exhaled shakily. "They were looking for us," she whispered. Kosa nodded. "They will be back." Night fell once more, and the world turned cold. Clara sat near a small hidden fire, her mind racing. Every time she looked at Kosa, she wondered what he was thinking. His calm never broke, but his silence carried a weight that words could not. Finally, she asked, "What will happen when we reach the trading post?" Kosa stared into the fire. "You will find safety," he said. "There will be people there who can help you. And you." He didn't answer. She could tell from the way his shoulders stiffened that he already knew the answer she feared. He could not stay. To the settlers, he would be a threat, no matter what he had done. Sleep came slowly that night. When she did drift off, she dreamt of two worlds colliding, one built of fear, the other of silence. In her dream, Kosa stood between them, holding back a storm that neither side could see. At dawn, Kosa woke her gently. "We go now," he said, "before the sun rises high." They rode again, cutting through the valley where the tracks had faded. The wind carried the scent of smoke, the trading post was near. But something felt wrong. The land was too quiet. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. Kosa slowed the horse, his eyes narrowing. "Someone has been here," he said softly. They moved forward cautiously until the wooden fence of the post came into view. It was small. Just a few cabins, a corral, and a trading shed. But the place looked deserted. No smoke from the chimneys, no sound of voices. Clara's unease grew. "Where is everyone?" she whispered. Kosa dismounted, tying the horse to a post. "Stay here," he said. He walked slowly toward the trading shed, his knife drawn but low at his side. The wind lifted the edge of a torn flag that hung limply from the roof. Clara watched as he pushed the door open. Moments later, he stepped back out, his face grim. "They are gone," he said. But they did not leave by choice. Fear crept through her. "You mean?" Kosa nodded. "The men who followed us came this way. They took what they wanted and left nothing behind." The weight of his words sank into her chest. There was nowhere safe now. Not from the men who hunted them, not from the desert, and not from the past that followed them both. Kosa looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher. "We move north," he said. "There is an old mission there. Maybe someone still lives." Clara wanted to ask how he could still keep hope, but she didn't. The look in his eyes said enough. He had seen too much to believe in safety, yet something in him refused to surrender. As they rode away from the silent trading post, the desert stretched endlessly before them again, vast, harsh, and uncertain. Behind them, smoke rose faintly into the sky, curling like a warning, and somewhere in that distance, unseen but moving closer, the sound of drums began again. Slow at first, then steady. Beating with a rhythm that promised their journey was far from over. The wind carried a strange heaviness as they rode north, the kind that makes the land feel alive and watching. The sun hung low, casting long, sharp shadows across the desert floor. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat, steady but uncertain. Clara could feel the unease rising in her chest. She tried to keep her thoughts steady, but every sound made her tense. The rustle of dry grass, the faint cry of a hawk, even the whisper of wind between the rocks. Kosa's posture had changed too. He rode with his head slightly lowered, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. For hours they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was full of awareness. Both knew something was closing in. The men who had followed them before hadn't stopped. The tracks Kosa kept finding told her that much, though he never said it aloud. The land felt tighter, as if every canyon and ridge was holding its breath as evening approached. They reached the edge of a narrow valley. The ground dipped between two tall ridges, lined with scattered pines and sharp rocks. It would have been a good hiding place under any other circumstance, but Kosa didn't look at it that way. He studied the terrain with the caution of a man who'd survived too many close calls. "We ride through," he said quietly. "No stopping." Clara nodded. The fatigue in her body screamed for rest, but she didn't protest. She trusted his instincts more than her own hope. As they entered the valley, the air cooled suddenly, and shadows stretched long across the path. The silence was too complete now, so complete that even the wind seemed to have stopped moving. Halfway through the valley, Kosa halted the horse so abruptly that Clara almost slipped forward. He raised his hand, motioning for stillness. Clara froze, barely breathing. His head turned slightly, his eyes scanning the ridge to the right. A sound drifted down, a faint scrape. Like a boot against stone, Kosa's hand went to his rifle. "They are here," he murmured. Before she could speak, a gunshot cracked through the still air. The horse reared, screaming, and Clara clung desperately to the saddle. Kosa pulled her down, shielding her behind a boulder as another shot struck the ground nearby. Kicking up dust and stone, voices echoed from above. Men shouting, laughing, the cruel sound of confidence. Clara's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Kosa crouched beside her, his eyes hard and calm. "Stay down," he said firmly. She nodded, trembling, clutching her stomach. The baby moved, then a small, sharp flutter that made her bite back a sob. This was not the place for a child to come into the world. Not here. Not like this. Kosa fired once, the shot ringing loud through the canyon. A cry followed from the ridge, and then silence. For a moment, it seemed they had a chance. But then came the sound of more horses approaching fast. "They have more men," Clara whispered. Kosa didn't answer. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We move," he said. "Now." They ran along the narrow path, the horse limping behind them, wounded but still able to follow. Bullets whistled past, striking rocks and dirt. The echo of gunfire filled the valley like thunder. Clara stumbled, nearly falling, but Kosa caught her, pulling her along until they reached a break in the ridge, a narrow opening between two slabs of stone. He led her inside, pushing through dry brush until they came into a hidden hollow surrounded by boulders. From here they could see the valley below, but were hard to spot from above. Kosa dropped to one knee, reloading quickly. Clara sat against the rock, gasping for breath. Her body ached, her mind spinning with fear and exhaustion. "They'll find us," she said softly. Kosa looked at her, his eyes steady and determined. "Not yet," he said. "We make them search where we want them to." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the cliffs. He knew every inch of the land mattered now. Every shadow could hide an advantage or a death trap. Clara watched him move, calm even under fire. There was something in his presence that steadied her, a quiet strength that didn't come from anger or pride, but from a deep, stubborn will to protect. The sound of hooves grew closer. Kosa crouched low, watching the ridgeline. He could see them now, 5 men, maybe 6, their shapes outlined against the fading light. They moved with the swagger of those who thought they owned the land. Kosa waited until they passed below the ridge, then motioned to Clara to stay silent. He picked up a loose stone and threw it across the rocks. It hit hard, echoing down the opposite side of the canyon. The riders turned sharply, firing in that direction. "Good," Kosa muttered under his breath. "Keep your eyes there." He slipped away from the hollow, moving like part of the desert itself, silent, deliberate. Clara wanted to call out, to beg him not to go, but she bit her lip and stayed still. She watched the shapes in the distance and prayed he knew what he was doing. Minutes passed like hours. Then a sharp cry split the air, followed by chaos, gunfire, shouts, the sound of horses panicking. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, her heart racing. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. Fear twisted inside her. When Kosa reappeared, his breathing was heavy, his arm streaked with blood. She reached for him in alarm, but he shook his head. "Not mine," he said quietly. "One of them won't follow." He crouched near the opening again, listening. The remaining riders were shouting to each other, their voices growing distant. Some were leaving, others circling wide. Kosa's eyes narrowed. "They'll come from the north next," he said. "We move before they do." He helped her back onto the horse, though it limped with every step. They followed a dry riverbed, moving fast through the gathering dusk. Clara's vision blurred from exhaustion. Every bone in her body cried for rest, but she kept going. She could see the strain on Kosa's face, tooth a tight jaw. the glance he kept throwing over his shoulder as the first stars began to appear. They reached a high ridge overlooking a stretch of plains. Beyond it, in the faint distance, stood what looked like the outline of a building of mission. Its roof half gone, its walls leaning but still standing. Kosa pointed toward it. "There," he said. "We make for that place." "Stone walls. Easier to defend?" Clara nodded weakly. "Will they stop?" "No," he said. "Not until one of us falls." They pressed on through the dark, guided only by starlight. The mission grew clearer as they approached a ruin from another time, its old cross still standing crooked against the sky. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with dust. Kosa led the horse into a corner and barred the doorway with a fallen beam. He lit a small fire in the center of the room, careful to keep it dim. The flickering light revealed faded murals on the walls. Saints, angels, symbols of peace that time had nearly erased. Clara sank to the floor, her body trembling from exhaustion. "Will they find us here?" She asked. Kosa looked toward the doorway. "They'll look everywhere," he said. "But if we are quiet, we may have some time." He sat beside her, wiping the sweat from his brow. For the first time, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything he carried. "You could have left me," she said softly. "Why didn't you?" He didn't look at her. "Because once someone left me too," he said quietly. "And I remember what it felt like." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the night was alive with distant sounds, the cry of coyotes, the whisper of wind through broken windows. But underneath it all there was something else, a faint, steady rhythm. Clara froze. "Do you hear that?" Kosa's head lifted. He heard it too. Horses, moving fast. He rose, his expression hardening. "They're here." She grabbed his arm. "Kosa, please, there must be another way." "There is no running now," he said, his voice calm but fierce. "This ends here." He moved to the doorway, checking his rifle. Clara tried to stand, but the pain in her body was sharp, pulling her down again. The contractions had started, small but real. Panic surged through her. "Kosa." He turned, eyes widening slightly as he saw her face pale with pain. He stepped back to her side, kneeling. "It's coming?" She nodded, tears welling. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "You must." The sound of horses outside grew louder, circling the mission like wolves. Shadows passed across the doorway, voices calling out. Kosa's hand tightened on his rifle. He glanced at her again, torn between two impossible choices. Outside, one of the men shouted, "We know you're in there." "Come out, Apache, and maybe we'll let the woman live." Kosa's eyes darkened. "They lie," he said quietly. Clara gripped his hand, her breathing uneven. "Don't let them take me," she whispered. His jaw tightened. His gaze flicking between the doorway and her trembling form. "They won't," he said, his voice low and certain. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting long, ghostly shadows across the crumbling saints. Outside, the riders dismounted, their boots crunching in the dirt. One of them began to count loudly. 1, 2. Kosa steadied his rifle. Clara's breath quickened, her hand clutching his tightly. The world outside closed in, the desert holding its breath, as if even it feared what was coming. And just as the man shouted, 3, the first shot tore through the silence, marking the moment when everything would change. The gunfire shattered the stillness. Echoing off the mission's old stone walls like the memory of every battle the land had ever seen, Kosa fired back without hesitation, his movements swift and deliberate. He knew every second mattered now. The air filled with dust and smoke, and Clara could barely see him through the flickering firelight. Her body tensed with pain as another contraction gripped her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Outside, attackers shouted to each other, their voices full of anger and confusion. They hadn't expected the Apache to fight like a man with nothing left to lose. Kosa's rifle cracked again and again, forcing them to retreat behind the old stone fence. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by Clara's labored breathing. Kosa crossed the room to her side, kneeling down. Sweat beaded on his forehead. and the determination in his eyes softened as he saw her pain. "You have to stay calm," he said gently. "Breathe slow. The child will come soon." Clara clutched his hand, trembling. "You can't stay here. They'll kill you." His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "If I leave, they'll kill you and the child too. I stay." Tears filled her eyes, not just from pain but from the weight of his words. The man who once seemed like a stranger, a warrior hardened by loss, was now her only protection in a world that had turned cruel. A sudden crash came from outside, the sound of a lantern shattering. Flames flared against the outer wall, and smoke began to creep in through the cracks. Kosa looked toward the doorway, realizing they were trying to smoke them out. He stood, pulling his knife from his belt. "Stay low. If they break through, don't move until I tell you." The smoke thickened quickly, swirling through the air like dark ghosts. The sound of boots approached the entrance, and Kosa took his position near the doorway. When the first man tried to enter, Kosa struck fast. The fight was short and brutal, and when it was over, the attacker lay still. The others hesitated, shouting curses from outside but not daring to rush in. Clara could barely keep her eyes open from the smoke. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and her vision blurred. "Kosa," she whispered, her voice faint. "I can't breathe." He turned, saw her struggling, and without hesitation, he moved to the back of the mission. There was a small window high on the wall, half hidden by a broken beam. He smashed through the remaining wood, letting in a rush of cool night air. "Here," he said, guiding her closer so she could breathe. "We'll go through the back once they think we're trapped." Outside, the men shouted again, trying to light another torch. Kosa looked back at Clarice, was pale, weak, and clutching her stomach. Time was running out. He tore his blanket in half, wetting it with what little water they had left, and placed it over her mouth and nose. "Breathe through this," he said. Another gunshot struck the doorway, splintering the old beam. Kosa knew they couldn't wait. He helped her up, guiding her toward the back wall. "Hold on to me," he said. "We leave now." With great effort, they climbed through the window, the rough edges scraping their hands. Outside, the desert night spread wide and silent. The stars burned bright above, indifferent to the struggle below. Kosa led her along the wall, keeping to the shadows. Behind them, the men were still shouting. Unaware their prey had slipped away. They moved toward the dark hills beyond the mission. Clara stumbled often, her strength nearly gone, but Kosa never let go. Each time she faltered, he lifted her back up. Whispering words she didn't understand, but somehow gave her courage. After what felt like hours, they reached a dry creek bed hidden between two ridges. Kosa helped her sit against a smooth rock and listened for any sounds of pursuit. None came. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was quiet. Only the wind moved through the brush. Clara leaned back, breathing heavily. "It's time," she said weakly. "The baby. It's coming." Kosa froze for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he nodded once, steady and calm. "Then it will come here. The world does not choose the time. The child does." The night stretched long and hard. Kosa did what he could, his rough hands gentle as he tried to comfort her. He'd seen death many times, but never life coming into the world. It humbled him in a way he couldn't name. The stars seemed closer, the earth quieter, as if even the desert was watching. When the first cry broke the silence, Kosa let out a shaky breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Clara held the small, fragile baby against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "A girl," she whispered. "She's a girl." Kosa sat beside her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened. "She's strong," he said quietly. "Like her mother." Clara looked up at him through her tears. "Like you." He shook his head slightly, almost smiling. "No, I've just lived long enough to know strength when I see it." The baby quieted, her small hand curling around Clara's finger. For a moment, all the fear and pain of the night faded away. There was only peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. By dawn, the sky began to lighten with soft shades of pink and gold. Kosa stood, scanning the horizon. He saw no sign of pursuit. The men had likely assumed they'd died in the burning mission. The fire had been fierce enough to make it believable. When Clara woke, Kosa handed her a small piece of dried meat from his pack. "We go east," he said. "There's water in 2 days' ride, maybe a settlement beyond that." She nodded, her body weak but her spirit stronger than ever. "And then?" He looked toward the rising sun. "Then you start again. A new life. Away from all this, and you?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the horizon, on the endless stretch of land that had always been both his home and his prison. "My path isn't made for peace," he said finally. "But maybe yours is." She wanted to tell him to stay, to ask him not to disappear back into the wild where pain lived heavier than comfort. But when she saw the quiet resolve in his face, she understood. Some souls were meant to keep walking. As the day warmed, they packed what little they had and set out. Kosa walked beside the horse, making sure Clara and the baby were safe. The desert around them no longer felt cruel-lit, felt ancient and vast. Carrying the weight of all who had walked it before, by the second night they reached the river. The water shimmered under the moonlight, and for the first time, Clara smiled without fear. Kosa helped her set up a small camp, and as the baby slept, they sat in silence beside the fire. "You'll find people east," he said softly. "Good people. Tell them you came from the borderlands. They won't ask too many questions." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You saved me, Kosa. You saved us." He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I only gave you a chance." She reached for his hand, but he stood before she could speak. "When the morning comes, follow the river. It will take you to the road. Where will you go?" she asked. He hesitated, then glanced toward the far hills. "Where the land still remembers my people."
Ow.
When dawn broke, Clara woke to find him gone. Only his footprints remained, leading away from the camp and disappearing into the desert. She held the baby close, her heart heavy yet full of gratitude. The rising sun painted the world in gold, and for the first time, she felt a fragile hope stirring inside her. She looked down at the child, who opened her tiny eyes and blinked at the new day. "We'll be all right," she whispered, "because he showed us how." Far off beyond the horizon, the wind carried the faint sound of an eagle's cry, a wild, lonely call that seemed to echo Kosa's spirit. The desert, vast and untamed, swallowed it whole, keeping its secrets like it always had. And as Clara began her long walk east, the world around her no longer felt empty. It felt alive, waiting, full of stories still to be written by those brave enough to survive them.